We just recited the verse of refuge, which is to the Buddha, Dharma, and Supreme Assembly, I go for refuge until enlightenment. Through the collections from my practice of generosity and so forth, may I attain Buddhahood to help all sentient beings. This is a verse we always recite, and it seems you know it quite well. You recite it very naturally. So I'm going to explain this verse in a bit more depth. If we look at the first two lines, I go for refuge until enlightenment to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, they indicate refuge. If we look at the third and fourth lines, through the collections from my practice of generosity and so forth, may I attain Buddhahood to help all sentient beings, they indicate bodhicitta. Let's start with refuge. Refuge is fundamental for us as Buddhists. If your Dharma practice is qualified by refuge, it becomes a proper Buddhist practice, right? What that means is your practice should be qualified by faith in the three jewels, right? Only then does your Dharma become Buddhist Dharma. Otherwise, if you think, well, I'm a Buddhist, therefore whatever practice I do is automatically a Buddhist Dharma practice, that's not true. Fundamentally, it should be rooted in refuge if it is to be a Buddhist practice. So there are many approaches to the explanation of refuge. You can go very deep and explain it at a high level, or you can explain it in a very coarse way. If you explain it at a high level, then it needs to be explained in terms of the two truths, then the four truths, and then through an understanding of the qualities of each of the three jewels. Right? If you understand refuge to this depth, then you're creating a foundation for liberation. So I'll go a little bit into the causes of refuge and how to carry out your refuge, how to practice refuge, and explain its benefits. And that's what I'm going to do in this class. If you look at the topic of refuge within Tsongkhapa's great treatise on the stages of the path, he explains it by way of 4 or 5 outlines. So the first outline is through which causes does one generate refuge. So before one actually goes for refuge, one has to fulfill certain causes and conditions. The next outline is to what does one go for refuge? Then the third outline is how does one go for refuge? And the fourth is the benefits and advantages of refuge. And then following that, Tsongkhapa explains the refuge precept. So my explanation is going to be based on this explanation in Tsongkhapa's great treatise. Let's look at the causes for refuge. There are 2 principal causes, and they can be summarized as fear and faith. Fear is exactly what you think it is. It is being afraid. It's being scared. And faith is, well, since in this case we're going for refuge to the 3 jewels, it's a faith that they can protect us from what we are afraid of. So these 2 are fundamental for refuge, and if one is not present, then it doesn't become proper refuge. For example, if you lack that element of fear, of being afraid, then it doesn't matter if you make prostrations and so forth, offerings out of faith alone. It's not a practice qualified by actual refuge. So taking refuge means to place your trust in something, right? Just as you would place your trust in someone if you have a problem and you really believe that this person can help you out and solve your problem. The classic example that is given is in prior times when a man is facing punishment by a king, right? And he's been put into prison and he's horrified of what is to come. And he places his hopes in let's say, a local chieftain or someone with a politician with a level of power that can help him out. So first of all, this person is afraid. And second of all, this person has faith that this person can help them and protect them from punishment. It's very similar to that. Even if we don't use this classic example of being afraid of a king's punishment, there's all sorts of laws that we can get into trouble with nowadays that we may need someone in a higher position of power to help us out with, right? It's still relevant today, that example. So essentially, we need to put our trust in someone who we have ascertained can help us out of this situation. And if we're talking about a very high level of understanding of refuge, then you need to realize through valid cognition that such a person can help get you out of this situation, right? In terms of the three jewels, you need to realize with valid cognition, not just have faith, but a proper understanding of how they can help protect you. But even without such a high level of realization of their potential, if you just have these two causes of fear and faith, your refuge is still valid. It is correct refuge. Loss. So taking back to this element of fear that is a cause of refuge, there's lots of fears that occur throughout our lifetimes. When we're younger, we worry about our education. When we get a bit older, we start to worry about our financial situation. And then as we get older and have children, then you start to worry about their future and how they're going to turn out as people. But this is irrelevant to the fear that we're talking about in connection to refuge in the three jewels, right? If you want protection from these types of fears in your life, these worries, you can figure it out without relying on the three jewels, essentially. Right? You can work out other methods. With respect to fear in connection to refuge, there's three types of fear, and they correspond to the scope of the person who is going for refuge. So the first type of fear is in connection to one's future rebirth. It's a worry about, will I achieve a good rebirth? It's not certain because there's a good chance I could fall into the lower realms, right? That sort of worry and concern leads to a refuge in an understanding that the three jewels can protect you from a bad rebirth in your next life, and you go for refuge like that. That is a refuge of a lower scope person, right? If you look at how the lamrim presents beings, it's in terms of beings of the lower scope, medium scope, and higher scope. So that's where your refuge would start. Worrying about your future rebirth and putting your trust in the three jewels that they can protect you from that. The second level pertains to beings of middle scope, right? Not only can the three jewels protect you from a lower rebirth in your future lives, they can protect you from the frights of samsara entirely. So your fear would be in connection to remaining in samsara. And then understanding the three jewels can protect you from that. You go for refuge, then your refuge is that of a medium scope being. Then with respect to persons of greater scope, their fear pertains to not only themselves being left behind in samsara, but all sentient beings too being left behind and not being able to escape. So based on that fear, they generate a faith in the three jewels that they can protect from that and have the potential to liberate all beings, oneself and others, from samsara, and they go for that type of refuge. So based on the three fears, you have the three types of faith, and therefore three levels of refuge. So are we afraid of the lower realms? What does it mean to be afraid of the lower realms? let's think about our conduct and behavior right now in this life. Let's try to weigh up our virtue compared to our non-virtue. Which is stronger in our practice? Most definitely, it's our non-virtue. Think about if someone says something really mean to you and the level of anger that you give rise to, right? How your face turns red, right? Your whole demeanor changes. How you then go on to think about what they said and think, what can I say back to them, right? So that I win in this situation. And for how long you actually spend ruminating on this thought, right? At the least a few minutes, at the most a few days, right? That's seems to be quite normal for us. That's common, right? And that's just one example of how our behavior falls into the side of non-virtue, right? Think about out of the 10 virtues, which ones you practice day to day versus the 10 non-virtues, right? I'm pretty sure that we fall into the side of the 10 non-virtues much more than we do the virtues, right? Think of it in a 24-hour period. Which virtues are we engaging in? Not much. Most of our thoughts go into thinking about food, clothing, reputation, right? How much of our time per day really goes towards Dharma thoughts, right? A few minutes, an hour maximum, maybe? A lot of people only turn to Dharma when they have difficulties in their life. They think, okay, what puja do I need to overcome this difficult situation? Okay, the pujas are virtuous activities, but there's still something to think about here. When you recite the refuge verse, for example, right? To the Buddha, Dharma, Supreme Assembly, I go for refuge until enlightenment through the collections of my practice of generosity and so forth may I attain Buddhahood to help sentient beings. It's easy to say it, but was your motivation pure before you recited this verse? Probably not. When you're actually reciting the verse itself, are you thinking about the meanings of the words and actually engendering a strong thought of refuge? Probably not. And likewise, at the end, when you make the dedication, are you making a pure dedication? Probably not. So it's really difficult to turn our activities into virtue, but so much easier for us to turn our activities into non-virtue, right? If we compare that again to getting angry, have the part where you generate a motivation, right? And then the actual act of getting angry, right? Where you say something really mean. And then the part where you rejoice, it's almost like a dedication. It's like, oh, I got them, right? I won in this situation, right? It's much easier and much more frequent to engage in non-virtue rather than virtues. So based on this, why are we so confident that we're going to have a good rebirth? It doesn't make sense if we look at our behavior now. There's a very good chance and a very high risk that we fall to the lower realms just based on our behavior in this life. So therefore, in consideration of this, as a daily practice, what you can do after you get up, you wash yourself, have breakfast, blah, blah, blah. Sit for 15 and 20 minutes and think about refuge, think about its causes, right? And actually try to generate a pure refuge and do that daily. How much can you improve in 1 month just by doing this, right? A lot. There's so much room for improvement. Of course, at the beginning, it might feel a bit awkward. You don't really know what you're doing, but you get into a flow and you can really improve your practice. And I say this because we as Buddhists often fall into this line of thought where we think, because I am Buddhist, whatever I do is virtuous, right? Everything I automatically do is Dharma, which is not true at all, right? If we lack these fundamentals of refuge, right? This fear of our next rebirth, and if we don't understand our current situation, right? What a precious opportunity we have found to practice the Dharma, and how unlikely it is to find this situation again. Right? Think of all your opportunities in this lifetime to come to teachings, to listen to the Dharma, and how difficult it would be to find this again in your next life, even if you manage to achieve a human rebirth. Right? Even if you manage to become a human again, you still have the sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and death to experience, and how very difficult it is to practice the Dharma. So the fear that someone of smaller scope has is a recognition of one's current behavior and practice, and understanding the very high chance of being reborn in the lower realms in the next life, and wishing to escape that fate, having faith in the three jewels and going for refuge in them, knowing that they have the power to protect one from that situation. So one starts with that level of refuge, and one needs to add on to it to get the next level of refuge of someone of middle scope, right? Someone of middle scope is not only afraid of having a lower rebirth in their next life, they're afraid of being reborn into samsara in general, right? So the lower rebirths are hell, animal rebirths, as explained extensively in Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo and so forth. So not only being worried about that, but being worried that even if one takes rebirth as a human in one's next life, there's no guarantee that one will be able to encounter and practice the Dharma again. Right? In order to achieve such a rebirth, right? A precious rebirth of a human being who does encounter and is able to practice the Dharma, there are many causes and conditions that need to come together, and they're not easy to assemble, right? As a basis, one needs a good practice of ethical discipline for such a rebirth. And then on top of that, a practice of the six perfections, right? Not just ethics, but patience, generosity, and so forth. And then one needs pure prayers, right? Prayers that aren't tainted by any thoughts of this lifetime, right? The goals of this life, but entirely concerned with one's future welfare, right? So if all of those come together, that helps one achieve a human rebirth in which one encounters the Dharma. But how difficult is it really for those causes to come together? It's very difficult if we think about how we conduct ourselves in this lifetime. So when we talk about our future lifetimes, we can talk about rebirths as humans or gods, but gods are, not something that we see or interact with, so let's just keep it on the level of being reborn as a person. So let's say we are reborn as a human in this world again. I mean, the situation already looking at it now looks pretty dire. Think about, 50 years in the future or 100 years down the line, how much worse the situation in this world is going to get, right? Whether you think of the environment or politics, it's only going to get worse, right? So, as a person in your next rebirth, you come into such a situation and you're already fundamentally affected by the sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and death, right? On top of whatever is going on in the world. So most of the time, we're experiencing the sufferings of aging and sickness, right? Birth is something that happens at the start of our lifetime, and death comes at the end. In between, right? We're affected by the suffering of aging. So we age every single second, right? If you think about our good years, right? Our prime between the ages of like 20 and 30, when we're really working on our knowledge and we're working on our physique, and it's not too bad. And then after that, every second, everything is just going downhill, really, if you think about it. It's just a constant state of decline after 30. But we don't even think about that, right? We don't think about second by second deterioration, right? Or suffering of aging. We only really notice it if we meet someone after a few years and think, oh, they've changed a little bit. But actually, people are changing every second. And then think about that, right? You have your prime years in life, but there's a whole period at the start as a human being where your education is not complete, right? You're not that smart, right? You still need to get smarter and learn more. You haven't got any experience, right? For the first 20 or so years, not experience that the world really values, if you think about it. And then once you finally get all that, right? You're educated, you have some experience, you get to the age where then your body just starts declining, right? Then it's just downhill, right? So the human situation is not that ideal, right? By nature, right? It's a constant process of birth, aging, sickness, and death. And if you think about sickness, it's not necessarily as frequent as aging. If it were to come chronically, right, second by second as aging, then we wouldn't be able to handle it, right? It would be very difficult. Fortunately for most of us, the suffering of sickness just comes from time to time. So, that being said, even if we are to achieve a human rebirth in our next life, that is not, right, we're not falling into the lower realms. It's still afflicted fundamentally by the sufferings of birth, aging, and sickness and death. Right? And Tsongkhapa reminds us in his foundation of all qualities that we're in a situation, right, in samsara where there is no satisfaction, right? We never get to a point where we've experienced some pleasure and we think, oh, that was enough, right? I don't need that anymore. Like once is enough, right? No, it's a constant craving. And then we have to think that our aggregates that we are born with in samsara are the basis for all this suffering, and they induce future sufferings as well. So there's no end to it. So one needs to really think, I need to leave this situation fundamentally. Remember last time somebody asked a question about, can Rinpoche please
Sophie,
expand on this topic
Sophie,
of, yes?
sorry. The sound broke off in the middle, like maybe 2 sentences ago.
Oh, I'm
Uh,
sorry. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So
uh,
probably where
uh,
we got to talking about Tsongkhapa's foundation of all good qualities.
I think she cannot hear now. Hello, you can hear me?
I
Can you
can
hear
hear
me?
you. It shows that your internet is not good.
Wow. So impermanent in Wi-Fi internet.
Yeah, so even if you come to a Dharma teaching, the internet might be bad and you don't get to hear it.
We'll try.
So how is it now?
But now we can hear you. So do you want to try the five
Yeah,
all
yeah,
good?
yeah, I can try.
Okay,
It
yeah.
shows that the Gaden Shartse Dro-Phen Ling internet is like sometimes bad connection, sometimes good on Zoom.
Okay, now it's good maybe.
Okay, yeah, yeah, we keep trying, no
Yeah,
problem.
okay.
So Tsongkhapa said in his foundation of all good qualities that there's no satisfaction to be had, right? We never get to a point where we think, I've experienced this pleasure and I've had enough, right? We always crave more. And likewise, Tsongkhapa reminds us that our aggregates are the door to all suffering, right? They're the basis of it all. And it never ends so long as we maintain these aggregates. So we need to leave samsara. And by that, we need to leave these aggregates which are by nature flawed. And somebody asked Rinpoche about this in the last class for Rinpoche to please expand upon what this third type of suffering of all-pervasive suffering is, and it's essentially this. It is this situation of maintaining these aggregates which perpetuate samsara, right? They are the basis of suffering and they induce all future suffering. There's also a verse in Tsongkhapa's Three Principal Aspects of the Path where he describes how our situation is as if we are being carried away by the powerful current of four rivers. And the verse is, beings are swept along by the powerful current of the four rivers, tightly bound by the chains of their karma, so difficult to undo, ensnared within the iron trap of their self-grasping, and enshrouded in the thick darkness of ignorance. So the four rivers are birth, aging, sickness, and death. And we are always swept along by their powerful currents, right? It's as if we've fallen into a river, and that's already quite scary, right? To fall into a great river with a strong current is really scary. But on top of that, you don't know how to swim. And on top of that, your limbs are bound. And not only that, you're in the dark, right? That is like our current situation, right? And these analogies are showing us, one, that we are totally under the influence of our karma, right? Without control, it is influencing our lives. And then, due to our self-grasping, whatever we do, right? Whatever non-virtue we do, we're ensnared within the iron trap of our self-grasping, right? And we can't get out of that. And then we're enshrouded in a thick darkness of ignorance, right? We don't know the nature of reality. We don't know the path to liberation. Right? We don't know how things really exist, right? And in that sense, we're in a state of darkness. So such is our situation, and that is samsara. And samsara is not some quick process, right? You can't say it starts here and it ends there, and this is when you're going to get out. Instead, it's beginningless and endless, and we're constantly tormented by the three sufferings, right? Suffering is suffering, suffering of change. It's all pervasive suffering. And we need to think about this and understand it because so often we get comfortable and we delight in samsara. We like our situation. And we don't think about its true nature, but we need to change our perspective, right? So these explanations of fear that I've given and the nature of samsara based on Tsongkhapa's presentation in the Lamrim Chemo, in his foundation of all good qualities, and his three principal aspects of the path all explain how our situation is rooted in the suffering of birth, sickness, aging, and death. And we do really need to get scared, right? It's not just getting scared for no reason. It's looking at the reality of our situation, right? It's a reality worth being afraid of, right? And I'm trying to introduce you to recognize this reality, right? Just like some people think that they're really healthy when they go for a checkup at the doctor's, and then the doctor finds something wrong and says, actually, you have this illness and you need to take this medicine. Likewise, the Buddha made people recognize that they are in a state of suffering. And he taught them what to do to escape it. Right? So here, I don't want you to get afraid just for the sake of getting afraid. That's silly. I want you to recognize the suffering nature of samsara and develop fear based on that. So out of fear for all of samsara, one takes refuge in the three jewels, thinking they have the capacity to protect me from samsara. And that is refuge of the middle scope. So now we need to look at a few important points that come under refuge of greater scope persons. Right? One of those points is compassion. We don't have a lot of time to go into depth on this topic, and also later we're going to look at bodhicitta in particular. So now we'll just spend a little bit of time looking at the topic of compassion. There's a verse in Shantideva's Bodhisattva's Way of Life that essentially says, you know, my future Buddhahood relies on both Buddhas and sentient beings, but it's the Buddhas I seem to respect more, but in fact, I also need to have such respect for sentient beings likewise. Right? If you think ultimately we're all going to achieve Buddhahood, and in order to achieve that, there are many stages of practice that we must employ along the way. And both of those, whether our future Buddhahood or our current practice, rely on both Buddhas and sentient beings. So if you think about your generation of compassion, that requires sentient beings as its focal object. Or your practice of patience, that requires a sentient being that you don't like, right? Someone who's annoying you. And likewise, your guarding of ethics requires sentient beings, right? As its foundation. And even in a worldly sense, your food, clothing, reputation, and so on and so forth all come about in dependence upon your fellow sentient beings. So whether dharma or worldly activities, whether ultimate happiness or temporary happiness, both of those depend on both Buddhas and sentient beings. However, we give so much more respect to the Buddhas, right? And we look down on sentient beings as lesser. But that's not something we should do, right? We should really evaluate how important sentient beings are, how precious they are in order to achieve our future Buddhahood, right? And if we can think in this way, then our refuge becomes a greater scope refuge, right? We consider ourselves Mahayana practitioners, and therefore we need to elevate our refuge to a level of greater scope refuge, right? And for that, out of the three fears that I explained, we require the third kind of fear, right? That's founded on the first two, right? Not just being afraid of being reborn in the lower realms, not just being afraid of being reborn again into samsara, but being afraid that yourself and all other mother sentient beings will be left behind in samsara. And taking that into consideration, thinking, may they all be free from samsara, and it is the three jewels that have the power to protect them from these frights. I go for refuge to them, and thus thinking in this way, our refuge becomes a Mahayana refuge, right? A greater scope refuge. Okay, so today we've gone over the two main causes of refuge, which are fear and faith. Well, out of those, we've covered fear. We'll talk about faith in another session. So if I just summarize again what I've spoken about today, I'd like you to reflect on the main points after class when you go back into your daily life. Sort of bring it into your practice. Right? First, when you try to do this, right, you're not going to engender much feeling. It won't feel like much has changed when you start to reflect on these points. But you need to allow time for this to happen, right? After 20 or 30 days of reflecting on the main points of what I've spoken about today, you'll start to see or notice a change in your attitude. And you'll start to see the benefits of thinking in this way. And once you see the benefits, your refuge will become more stable, right? And that's the goal. We want a firm refuge based on its proper causes. So if we think, if I go for refuge and practice in this way, right, properly, next life I will take a good rebirth, and this is sure, right? This is said in the sutras, their commentaries, and it's also proved by logic. If you practice Dharma with pure refuge, you are guaranteed to take a good rebirth. So, in order to reflect on these main points we've gone over today, you don't need to sit cross-legged and maintain some sort of stereotypical Buddhist posture. Important is that you're comfortable, right? Even if you're not seated, right? You can reflect on these points. But if you can allot some time to just sit, right? Straight back, relaxed body, and reflect, first of all, we need to develop some fear about the reality of our situation, right? We need to reflect on that we won't live for that long. At some point, we will die, and when we die, only the Dharma will be of benefit. Because after we're dead, we're going to be led into our future life by our own karma. And reflecting in this way, we realize, well, my karma is such that in this life, I didn't accumulate that much virtue. I accumulated a lot of non-virtue. So there's a risk that I could take a lower rebirth. Or even if I'm reborn as a human or a god, fundamentally I'm afflicted by the suffering of birth, aging, sickness, and death, right? That is unescapable, right? One cannot escape this rope of karma that binds us from life to life. So choose what you want to reflect on, right? Day to day, after you leave this class. And please try, right, to bring into your practice the thought that these kind sentient beings around me also deserve to be free from samsara and wish to help free them from samsara, right? It's important to try and engender that thought as much as possible. You don't need to sit down for that, right? You can be at work or driving, right? You can always think about wishing for sentient beings to be free from samsara, right? So please, I ask you to please try and think about that. So for us, it's definitely the case that out of these two causes for refuge, fear and faith, faith comes much more easily for us. Right? We're going to talk about faith later. And today was mostly about fear. And I'll leave it here. And there's one thing I forgot to say, but here, when you're sitting in these sessions, don't force yourself to sit in a cross-legged posture. Please, if it's uncomfortable for you, I invite you to stretch out your legs or whatever makes it comfortable for you to listen to these teachings. Thank you very much. I'll leave it here for today.